feel free to ask him any questions you might have throughout the day. So, for those of us who don't know us, we're a local nonprofit incorporated group. I've been around about approximately 2 years. We host a variety of local events just to promote electrification, basically. Not only cars, we're starting to look at a lot of things like buses and other smaller forms of personal transit. And some of the bigger issues that have been coming up over the last while, and one of the main reasons, obviously, that people drive electric is because of emissions, right? 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, actually in Saskatchewan, are from transportation. So this is some relatively low-hanging fruit. There are some really solid stats, I guess, coming from other provinces in Canada as to how well they're electrifying. And a lot of it comes down to incentives, other sorts of programs to encourage the adoption of electric vehicles, educational programs, and things like that. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions based around electric vehicles that, first and foremost, they don't work here in a climate like ours, that they're too expensive to own, and that they just won't work in our carbon-intensive power grid, right? And I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. The other thing, too, is not only from greenhouse gas emissions, but also air pollution in general, right? Especially in city centers. When we start to look at diesel particulate, right? And these factors, something called PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5, it's respirable, gets into people's lungs, and develops many long-term health effects down the road. So electrification of buses and public transport is key to this. Vehicle sales all across Canada, as far as electric vehicles, has been significantly growing. We actually have over 150,000 electric vehicles now in Canada. And actually here in Saskatchewan, I believe we just burst the 300 mark, and we're doing about 100% year-over-year increase in those vehicles. And a lot of that is just because of the myths and misconceptions sort of being addressed, right? As well, the industry is essentially heck bent on electrifying by 2025. They're doing everything they can to electrify because there are certain centers and bigger cities and provinces and countries all over the world that are basically not allowing internal combustion engines in a lot of their downtown core anymore, right? And that's pushing a lot of these automakers to electrify. And some brands are having a harder time than others in doing so. But the cost of batteries has basically dropped by over 1,000% in the last 10 years, so things are looking promising. Now, the big reason for electric is because of the cost of ownership. We do have some other electric vehicle owners here in the group, and any of them can attest to how cheap these vehicles are to operate, right? No more drives to the gas station, no more oil changes, no timing belts, no exhaust system. All of those things are all savings on our part. And the great news is that there's starting to be a lot more cost-effective electric vehicles that are coming to market all the time as those battery prices get lower. The other great benefits of driving electric is also the performance of the vehicles. Not everybody buys a vehicle for the performance, but it's something you kind of become addicted to in time. Even, let's say some of the cheaper, more affordable cars will have performance that's even better than some of the more performance-oriented or marketed vehicles that are on the road. They're much more fun to drive, and actually I consider some of the performance orientation of these vehicles actually be a safety feature in a sense. So the other big thing with this now that goes hand in hand, obviously, with electric vehicles is people always ask, where am I going to charge my car, right? There's not enough charging stations around, and so on and so forth. The good news is that for anybody who has access to 110-volt electrical plug-in, that can basically be your charging station. Now, if you're going to be doing longer trips or going to public gathering spaces, parks, parkades, shopping malls, places like that, there's starting to be a rollout or deployment of these sorts of types of infrastructure. And the great news is that through Natural Resources Canada and the federal government, there's many different resources of not only funding, but means to get that stuff installed. And so that's where we start to have this conversation locally about getting those charging stations installed and being able to build that sort of infrastructure here, not only in this city, but all across Saskatchewan. As far as the general investment too, for larger charging infrastructure like the fast charging networks, we've been very lucky over the last year. We've had a significant amount of infrastructure that's been invested. For example, last fall, I drove all the way to San Francisco in California, 7,000 kilometer round trip. It really didn't take any longer than driving a conventional gas car, and it cost about $200 in electrons to get there. So it was fantastic.
Is that there and back?
There and back for less than $200. In closing, we have to put a priority on getting a lot of this infrastructure built locally so that people can drive these cars locally. As well, we have to start to look at mass transit things with city buses, making sure that we get those emissions down. And in the words of the famous James Whittingham, for those of us who have solar panels on our roof already and drive electric vehicles, we basically have a refinery on our roof and a gas station in our garage.